I've been on the bench for a long time, and one thing I've learned is that the size of a lawsuit doesn't always tell you how much trouble is hiding behind it. Sometimes people come into my courtroom fighting over thousands of dollars. Sometimes it's property, contracts, family disputes, or broken promises that stretch back years. And then there are cases like this one. At first glance, it looked almost absurd. The amount in dispute was so small that most people would have rolled their eyes and moved on with their lives. But the longer I sat there reviewing the file, the more I realized that this wasn't really about money at all. It was about principle. And principles have a funny way of costing people far more than the original debt. The day this case was scheduled, something unusual happened before we even got started. We waited, and waited, and waited. The plaintiff never showed up. Normally, that would be the end of the story. If the person bringing the lawsuit doesn't appear in court, dismissal is often the natural outcome. But by the time this case reached me, court business had already been completed for the day, and I had spent enough time looking through the paperwork to know that dismissing it might not actually solve anything. In fact, I suspected it would only delay the inevitable. The defendant, a young man named Lambert, was present. He appeared respectful, polite, and surprisingly calm considering the circumstances. As I looked at him, I thought to myself that he didn't seem like a bad person. But being a bad person and being wrong are two very different things. The paperwork revealed a remarkably simple story. A woman had loaned him $60. Not $600, not $6,000. 60. According to the documents, the agreement was straightforward. She would lend him the money, and he would repay it within a week. Simple. Or at least it should have been. The problem was that the week came and went, and the money never returned. Now, I've heard every excuse imaginable from people who fail to repay debts. Some are creative. Some are ridiculous. Some are outright fiction. Lambert's explanation fell somewhere in the middle. He admitted that he had promised to repay the loan. He admitted that he missed the deadline. He admitted that he was wrong. Those admissions immediately caught my attention because most people spend half their time in court trying to avoid responsibility. Not Lambert. He openly acknowledged his mistake. But then came the explanation. According to him, he was expecting money from someone else. That person owed him money, and he believed he would receive it before the repayment deadline arrived. When that money never materialized, he suddenly found himself unable to repay the loan. It's a story I've heard many times. One person depends on another person. That person depends on somebody else, and before long, nobody gets paid. The problem with that logic is simple. When someone lends you money, they're not entering into a partnership with every person who owes you a debt. Your obligation remains your obligation. Still, I listened carefully, because sometimes circumstances matter. Then another detail emerged. His next payday arrived, and even then, he didn't repay the $60 immediately. That was the moment I started to see where this situation had gone off the rails. The original missed deadline was one thing. Failing to repay after receiving a paycheck was something else entirely. Now we weren't talking about inability. We were talking about delay. And delay has consequences. The woman eventually became frustrated. She threatened legal action. At some point, she had simply had enough. So she filed a lawsuit. That lawsuit cost her $30. And here's where the story took an unexpected turn. Once legal papers entered the picture, Lambert finally repaid the original $60. The debt itself disappeared. Gone. Finished. Paid. Most people would assume the dispute ended there. But not this plaintiff. Instead, she continued pursuing the case. Why? Because she wanted reimbursement for the $30 she had spent trying to recover her money. Suddenly, the entire lawsuit was about court costs. $30. That was it. $30. As I reviewed the file, I found myself almost amused by the determination involved. Think about it. A person spends $30 to recover $60, then remains determined enough to continue fighting over the $30 spent collecting the $60. That takes persistence, or stubbornness. Sometimes the difference is difficult to determine. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that if I simply dismissed the matter, there was a good chance this woman would come right back. She seemed incredibly determined. The type of person who refuses to let go once she believes she has been wronged. So I decided to examine the bigger issue. Not the legal issue, the human issue. I looked at Lambert and considered what was sitting in front of me. Here was a young man who had borrowed money, failed to repay it when promised, failed to repay it promptly after payday, forced the lender to file a claim, and only then returned the original amount. Legally, he had arguments. Morally, the picture looked very different. As our discussion continued, Lambert explained that after tensions developed between him and the woman, communication became difficult. They worked different schedules. They rarely saw one another. Days passed. The debt remained unpaid. The explanation might have sounded reasonable to some people. Not to me. When you owe somebody money, finding them becomes your responsibility. You don't wait for convenience. You make the effort. That's what responsible adults do. The deeper issue wasn't $60. The deeper issue was accountability. Then I began thinking several steps ahead. I imagined what would happen after this hearing ended. Suppose I dismissed the case entirely. Suppose the plaintiff had a legitimate reason for missing court. What then? Would she simply forget about the $30? Based on everything I had seen, I doubted it. Strongly. This woman had already demonstrated remarkable determination. She had filed once. She could easily file again. And if that happened, everybody would be right back where they started. More paperwork, more frustration, more wasted time. So I decided to give Lambert an opportunity. Not a legal opportunity, a practical one. I pointed out the obvious reality. The woman had spent $30 because she believed she had no other way to recover her money. That expense existed because of his delay. Whether he liked it or not, there was a direct connection between his actions and her costs. I was essentially handing him a solution, a chance to close the chapter permanently. Pay the $30, end the dispute, move on with life. Simple, reasonable, clean. As I watched him consider the situation, I wondered whether he recognized the opportunity sitting right in front of him. Sometimes people become so focused on being technically correct that they lose sight of what actually serves their interests. This felt like one of those moments. I explained that the plaintiff appeared persistent enough to continue pursuing the matter. I explained that ending the conflict now would likely save everyone future trouble. And I explained that while mistakes happen, taking responsibility often costs less than continuing a fight. Then came the moment that surprised me. I offered him one final chance, one final opportunity to put the issue behind him forever, and he refused. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just plainly. He didn't want to do it. At that moment, the legal path became clear. Without the plaintiff present, there was only so much the court could do. The case would be dismissed, and that's exactly what happened. But before concluding the matter, I wanted him to understand something important. There are times when people win arguments and lose something much more valuable. There are times when a person stands on firm legal ground while standing on shaky moral ground. This was one of those times. As I looked at Lambert, I told him what I genuinely believed. He was strong in his position, very strong. But morally, he was wrong. Those words summed up the entire case. Not because the amount of money mattered, not because $30 would change anyone's life, but because promises matter. Responsibility matters. And when someone helps you during a difficult moment, repaying that help promptly matters too. The gavel came down, the hearing ended, the file closed. Yet as I reflected on the case afterward, I couldn't help thinking about how often the smallest disputes reveal the biggest truths about people. A $60 loan had turned into a courtroom battle. A $30 filing fee had become a matter of principle. And a young man who appeared honest and decent had learned a lesson that had nothing to do with law. Sometimes being legally right is not enough. Sometimes the real verdict is moral. And those are the verdicts people remember long after the paperwork disappears.